Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This webinar series is put on by the Iowa Beef Center at Iowa State Extension. And our goal with this is just to help producers really tone in and focus on making the most out of their breeding season. So in this series, we're going to cover four main things. So the first is nutrition of the cow herd, which is what we're going to talk about today. And then our other series will include management of the cow as well as the bull. And then we're going to end up with talking about heterosis and some of the benefits that it can bring to the table as well. So my name is Erika Lundy, and I serve as the Southwest Iowa Extension Beef Specialist for Iowa State University. And Beth Reynolds, which is our program specialist from the Beef Center through Extension, are going to be tag teaming today's talk. So today we're really focused on nutrition and what kind of a role that plays in regards to our reproduction. So in Iowa, roughly 75% of our calves are born in the spring. So for the majority of us, March, April, and May are pretty critical times for setting the tone for what our calf crop is going to look like this year, but also for what that calf crop is going to look like in 2021. So our goal today isn't really to make you a nutritionist and provide you with some recommendations for what you should be feeding your cows, but rather kind of get you thinking about what your cow requirements look like, kind of the environment that you're putting her in, and really helping make sure that she's going to prepare for that next calf that she should be conceiving fairly shortly. So the primary goal of the beef cow is to produce a calf every 365 days. So if we're much longer than this, we're losing money, and it's really hard for us to get that female to breed back much quicker than this time point. So in order to maintain that 365-day calving window, basically that means we've got 80 days to set the stage for that cow to conceive after she's already calved. So when we're starting to talk about breeding season, the main thing that we think about it is how in estrus, or that lack of expression of estrus of that female, how we can kind of make sure that that female is ready to be cycling so that we can get her bred on time. So the presence of the calf, what her nutritional status looks like, her age, that's going to make a difference too. So those younger females take a little bit longer to recover from calving than those mature females do. And then of course too, if we have some difficulty during that calving season, there might be some dystocia issues that would increase how long that cow is going to take to recover from that calving and be prepared to breed again. So our statistic that we have here in the box towards the bottom is kind of shows a big variation there, but on average, half of our females aren't cycling the week before the breeding season begins. So that's a big percentage of our females that aren't quite ready yet to be cycling. So we're going to focus on hopefully how we can decrease that number and have more of those females that are cycling. So when we look at post-calving nutrition, or if you want to look at it from a pre-breeding nutrition standpoint, there's lots of things that are going on during this short time period. Our lactation increases our protein and our energy requirements by about 15 to 20% from what that requirement was during that last third of gestation. So that makes a big impact on how difficult it is to add body weight to those cows during that time point. We know that it takes a cow about 4 years to reach mature weight. So for those first and second calf heifers, their growth requirement is slowed down during this period of stage of production. But we do know that they have a greater requirement than mature females just because they are still growing themselves. One benefit that we do have is now our intake is a little bit greater during this period than when it was while she was still in gestation. So that gives us a little bit more flexibility in our diets and what we can do for those females. So now on top of all these requirements that are changing, now we're typically preparing those females to send them to grass. So we're going to have a little bit different set our diet's going to look like, but also for a lot of us in the state, that means that we're probably going to start mixing some groups, changing their environment. So there's a whole host of things that are going on outside of diet that it is impacting those females if they're prepared to be calving. All right, so body condition score, does it really matter? So we've learned here that a lot of us in Iowa, our producers are really good at looking at their females and kind of assessing what their condition looks like. So is that something, they can typically look at their females and know if they're adequate condition or not, or if they're under condition. But we really kind of struggle to actually write down and record what those body condition scores might look like. And so that's kind of a lack of having those records doesn't really help us come back and figure out, why that cow didn't stick AI, or if she weaned off a lightweight calf. So you've probably noticed on your screen that there has been a polling question that has popped up. So if you'll take some time there and answer that question for us, that just kind of gives us a little feedback on what you guys are doing now. So if we look at these two pictures here, so both of these cows would be within calving within 30 days. So we can see that there's quite a bit of difference in the condition that they're carrying. So as we look over the ribs, the tail head, and in that brisket, there's quite a bit of variation between those two females. So that one on the top right obviously is a little bit heavier. I would probably call her a body condition score of a 6, 6.5. Versus that female on the bottom there is probably closer to a 3. So definitely under condition there from where we would like to see those females going into calving season.
All right, so the other part, thinking about body condition score, why we emphasize it so much, body condition score of that animal and her current energy reserves, especially at calving, is really highly correlated to our postpartum interval and our breeding success following that calving season. So this figure here is some older data from Huffington and others, but it has been repeated time and time and again, showing that those skinny cows in particular have a longer postpartum interval than those cows that are in the ideal 5 to 6 body condition. And so animals with less condition on them are going to take longer to breed just because their postpartum interval is extended. Intuitively, postpartum interval is really related to your pregnancy success as well as your body condition score. Again, this figure here illustrates body condition score at calving, and then the percent that were successfully bred back the following breeding season. Again, this is just some data pulled from Selk and others, but this has been repeated time and time and again in various regions of our country. So another figure to emphasize, even as much as the body condition score at breeding or at calving, is to consider what her body condition score was at calving, and then by the time you breed that animal, what is her plane of nutrition? So is she increasing in body weight or losing body weight, and where did she start from? So again, this is some more data from Huffington and others, but with thin animals, you can still, even if they're below body condition score at calving, you can still successfully get them to breed if you're increasing their body weight and have them on a positive plane of nutrition. Your moderate or ideal body condition scores, if you're maintaining them, you can have a pretty successful breeding rate as well, but those really concerning animals are the animals that are thin, below a body condition score 5, and that are continuing to decrease body weight and in a negative energy balance. So now I think I'll let Erika talk again, but you should be seeing the results from the poll question that you guys took earlier, just to kind of gauge the audience that you're in.
So it looks like we're almost pretty evenly split on those that do and do not body condition score at the time of calving, with a few more that do. So this is something that we often get questions of too, is, all right, so I didn't actually body condition score at calving, so what do I do now? So Beth kind of led to it as well, that even though we take body condition scores at calving, that is more strongly correlated to what their breed back success will be versus trying to take that body condition score at the time of breeding. So if you haven't body condition score, now's a good time to go out and assess those cows and really look to see how they're looking. So in general, if they're moderate to fleshy, in adequate condition, there's likely that we're not going to need a whole lot of supplementation, assuming that we have adequate forage available. So we'll get into that a little bit later in the session, but that's kind of the big key from there. If those females are thin or moderate, supplementation is going to be necessary to make sure that we're on that positive plane of nutrition for those females. Keep in mind, it is simply just looking at our nutrient partitioning order. So that female is going to send those nutrients that she's consuming to lactation and to put on some additional energy reserves before she's going to think about returning back to estrus and start cycling. So if we're limiting those nutrients, we're not going to see that female cycling. It is possible to add some body weight on to those females now, but it really gets pretty expensive because we need to be supplementing a lot of energy and protein to those females in order to add that weight on, just because their requirements are so high. So some things to consider is if we're in that situation to really put the pencil to it and figure out what supplement might be the better deal. And then also too, if we find that there are some females that are lighter than others, to try to set so that we're not over supplementing females that don't necessarily need it. All right, so this chart and the next one are set up very similarly. And basically what it's showing is what our requirements of the beef cow and our replacement heifer look like based on the stage of production. So across the bottom there, we see the month since calving. And then we have our requirements. So this chart shows the protein requirements along the left side there. So beef cow would be that red bar, and our replacement heifer would be kind of that blue line that we see. And I really want to emphasize not to get caught up in the numbers, but more kind of the shape of what that curve looks like and how it changes throughout our stage of production. So for our mature cow here, basically our assumption is that it's a 1,400 pound cow. She was an adequate body condition score at the time of calving. We're going to come in and wean that calf in that 6 to 7 month range. So that's why we see that big drop in that requirements during that time period. And then as she goes through gestation, we start to see her requirement creep back up again. With the blue line in our replacement heifers, basically they are in adequate body condition, and we're targeting that 1.5 to 2 pound average daily gain through calving. So it's kind of a steady increase that we see there. A couple disclaimers here that based on our cow body weight, their milk production, some of those things, we definitely see this line shift either up or down, but as a whole, still that same shape of that female is pretty similar. So right now, basically, I mentioned this earlier, and March is when the majority of Iowa calves are born in the spring. So looking at those months 1, 2, and 3 is really a critical time point when we're trying to get those females to breed back, but they have the greatest requirements during that time point. This is the setup that we just talked about, except for this is looking at our energy requirements of those females. And so again, when we look at that peak lactation that's occurring somewhere in that 60 plus days after she's calved, that's when we see that greatest requirement that happens. So we can kind of manipulate this. So if we find our situations maybe in a drought setting where we don't have forage, we can wean those calves earlier and drop off that requirement of that female. So there's quite a big drop that happens there during that time point. So this slide, I really kind of just wanted to put together a visual of how requirements might line up with our forage availability that we have. So this is basically the same chart that we just showed. And now we see that our months are across the bottom here, basically to line up with how things look in Iowa. So in Iowa, most of our pastures are cool season grasses is the base of it. So we don't have a lot of forage production that's not really happening and vamping up until the first part of May into June is kind of where we see that peak. So if we overlay our requirements based on that, so most of our calves are born in March, so we see that peak in those cow requirements that happens in kind of the April, May timeframe. And a lot of times we just don't have that forage growth that's happening yet in that time period to really support what those cows' needs are. So that really kind of demonstrates that we do need to have some type of supplementation when we don't have that forage availability that is there for us.
Like Erika said, those requirements definitely shift based on that animal. So just for an example, milk production definitely influences the energy requirements for that female, and that cow age can also impact that. So when you look at milk production, this figure here is just showing, looking at a lower to higher milk production potential for animals and what for a female and what that net energy requirement megacal per day for her would be. To give you a bit of a reference, 5 pounds of corn would equal about 4 megacals of energy for that animal in a day, and 10 pounds of corn would be about 8 megacals of energy. So milk definitely influences. Those higher milkers are definitely going to have a lot higher energy requirements than those that have that lower genetic potential for milking ability. So with that in mind, just remember that it's important to match your cows to cow genetics to your environment. That will probably be touched on a little bit more in our final webinar when we're talking about genetics and heterosis, but getting an animal that her milk production lines up with what her feed resources are available in your area definitely needs to be taken into consideration. Here you can see where peak lactation falls. That's her highest requirements, and obviously it falls within her breeding season as well. So keep that in mind looking at your female and just determining any supplementation needs you might need. So far we've really pretty much only talked about mature animals, and then maybe those figures Erika just showed also had replacement heifer requirements on there as well. But some of those early young cows that are still growing really shouldn't be overlooked either. So first calf heifers versus mature cow, when you look at their energy requirements for early lactation, this figure here is kind of laying it out. Because the body weight for that younger heifer is smaller, she doesn't require as much energy to maintain her body weight. But once you add lactation on there, she's also not milking quite as much as a mature cow. So that energy requirement is a little bit lower as well. But she has an added growth requirement that mature cow does not. If you look at them straight across on grams of energy per day that cow needs, the mature cow actually has a little bit of a higher requirement than that first calf heifer, but that heifer is smaller, has less gut capacity, and cannot eat as much as that mature cow. So when you account for dry matter intake, the heifers need more of a nutrient-dense diet, and that's why when you do supplement animals, we emphasize supplementing those younger first and second calf heifers, because they need that energy density comparative to the mature cows in order to get that positive response and breed back a little bit better in the year. So this next couple charts here, so a recent Iowa State study, we call it our Cow Systems Project. Many of you have probably seen some data from that series, but in that project, it was a 2-year study, collected samples from various producers across the state. And this figure here shows the average pasture quality for all of those pasture samples that were taken, as well as the average of the bottom third of the samples and the average of the top third of the samples. So definitely keep in mind looking at this, that these were taken anywhere from early spring to later in the summer for pasture samples, and so don't necessarily get all focused in that earlier spring growth, but also that there was definitely variation within these pastures and how these pastures were managed. So some of the producers were very good about doing some intensive rotational grazing and keeping their grass really vegetative continuously for their cows, keeping it that higher quality. Some have really good integration of legumes in their forage base, so again, increasing the quality of that forage. And then, so looking at these, don't take it necessarily as, oh, my average pasture is 17% protein, but look at it as these are ballpark averages, and you need to know your own pasture and know your own forage base for what the basal diet quality is before you can really make decisions on what supplementation might be needed depending on time of year. So for early lactation requirements, a mature cow, even our lower quality pastures would, on average, would have met the protein requirements for that cow. Now, if you look at that early lactation requirement of the young cow, like we said, because her dry matter intake is lower than that mature cow, she needs a denser diet and needs more nutrients there. That low quality pasture wouldn't quite be enough to meet her requirement, but the average and high quality pastures did meet her requirements. And then finally, if you look at a replacement heifer, at the beginning of the breeding season, their only requirement is to continue to grow, and it's a pretty modest growth at that point in their life too. So hopefully they've been growing consistently throughout the year where you're not having to push them really hard at the end. But because they don't have any lactation going on, they actually have a fairly low nutritional requirement compared to the young cow and mature cow, and those pastures should be able to meet that requirement in that spring breeding season. So a similar story happens when you look at the energy requirements and the energy pasture quality for these animals. So again, same project, just looking at the TDN results for these pastures throughout Iowa, overlapping a mature cow requirement. Those low pastures didn't quite have enough energy to meet a requirement, and that's kind of expected. Energy is typically our most limiting nutrient in these cool season pasture systems. But on average, pastures met her requirements. When you look at the young cow, those average pastures didn't quite meet her requirements, and only those high quality pastures were satisfactory for what she needed. And then if you look at the growing replacement heifer, all three of the pasture qualities would meet her requirement, even though not by much on the low quality pastures. So big disclaimer here, all of that and all of the ability of a pasture to meet the demands of the animal and her nutritional requirements is highly driven by forage availability. So especially in our early pasture turning amount, there needs to be adequate growth for the animal to get a full bite when she goes to eat, and so she gets limited on the number of bites she can take per day, and so she needs that size of the bite and that low fiber washier forage to be big enough and have adequate growth where she can meet her requirements and eat enough throughout the day.
So now we're going to take the next few minutes here to kind of transition into what that supplementation on pasture might look like. And so, of course, that supplementation can be anything from other forages or some type of a grain or a corn co-product as well. So there's lots of options there. But really kind of our starting point I want to take an opportunity to talk about is to make sure that we understand that when we're supplementing so many pounds of a grain product, that's not a direct replacement for forage savings that we would see. So sometimes we have that kind of mentality that if we're going to provide 6 pounds of corn, that we're going to save 6 pounds of forage. So that's not necessarily the case here. So we've kind of already talked about how the plan of nutrition going into the breeding season and then also following the breeding season plays an important role on what those pregnancy rates would look like. So this is some study using some first calf heifers. It's actually a study where several universities partnered, and so this was out of University of Purdue in Wyoming. And basically what they were looking at is management of those heifers as soon as they were bred. So they had these heifers in various locations that were basically weaned, and from the time that they were weaned through breeding, they were fed the same diet, and basically their goal there was to achieve about 1.5 pounds average daily gain during that time frame. All of those heifers were then AI'd, and then they went to 3 different treatments there. So the red bar, our gain, was basically they were on maintain that same plane of nutrition. So again, targeting that 1.5 pound average daily gain after AIing. The next group and kind of that yellow bar there would be the maintenance, and those females are basically cut back so that they were kind of maintaining their body weight. So basically just requirements were met, but they weren't adding any weight. And then that last treatment there in the gray bar would be that their requirements were cut back to 80% of what their requirement would be. So there was some type of a restriction there, so they were likely to lose weight. And we look at it, there is some variation across farms, which is probably to be expected. But in general, those females that were maintained on that same plane of nutrition had about a 8 to 10% advantage in AI conception rates compared to those that were on a maintenance diet or were losing weight there. So that kind of reiterates the point to make sure that we're maintaining that plane of nutrition even a few weeks past what that breeding season is, just so we don't have some of that variation and diet transition that might be stressing those animals and causing them to not maintain that pregnancy. So this is some data out of South Dakota State University. And basically what they were doing here was looking at how those heifers responded to going out to pasture after they were AI'd. So this is very similar to what we see multiple places, the Midwest, but specifically in Iowa too. Typically once those replacement females are weaned, they're stuck in a Drylot situation and they really don't see grass again until after the breeding season. So the first kind of chart up top is basically looking at the steps per day that those females were taking. So that line across the top there with kind of the square bars would be those females that were placed on pasture prior to breeding, and the bottom across the bottom with those circles is more in a Drylot situation. So as we would expect, those females that were out on pasture had a larger area to cover, so they were taking more steps compared to those that were in the Drylot setting. When we look at the bottom, basically those females that were in the Drylot were placed in the same pasture as what those heifers were that were in that pasture to start with. So the first day that they were out there, basically those heifers that were in the Drylot previously took twice as many steps as those females that were already out on pasture. So this kind of reiterates the thought process that, you know, how we typically manage those heifers before, and if we change things, it kind of changes their behavior, and basically they have to relearn how to graze, and it changes their plan of nutrition too as well. This next slide is basically the same study, but just looking at what pregnancy rates look like. And you can see that those heifers that were in the Drylot before, so those naive grazers, basically had a 10% decrease in what their conception rates look like for the AI pregnancy, just by changing that diet and the environment that they were in. So this really kind of makes the point that we really want to consider how our management is and try to avoid making some of those dietary changes, environmental changes near that time of breeding. So even if we're supplementing beforehand, we want to continue to supplement for probably at least 30 days after we're AIing or just starting the breeding season, and make sure that we don't have too many changes that are happening during this critical time.
So this next slide here is kind of walking through some of our rule of thumbs for supplementation on pasture that we at the Beef Center use quite a bit. So they're based on a % of body weight on a dry matter basis. So when you're looking at supplementing animals and what you might want to supplement, definitely consider first and foremost what the cost of the nutrients are, not necessarily just the cost of the feed stuff, but cost of the feed stuff per pound of protein you're giving those animals. That way you can account for the nutrient density of that feed stuff as well. When you look at your dietary inclusion rates, our general rule is to keep corn or starch grain between 0.5% and 1% of the body weight per head per day. As her supplementation, when you go to a byproduct, similar there, although when in the processing to make those byproducts, a lot of the starch is removed, so there can be a little more flexibility, and that 0.5% is probably more on the conservative end. And then if you're using a digestible fiber source like a soybean hull, you can increase that to 1% comfortably. The co-products offer flexibility in forage-based feeding programs because they have a bit more of a diverse nutrient profile, but looking forward for this year, that might is likely not the most economic solution or possibility for you, even if you can find any of those co-products. When you look at energy supplementation strategies, if it's less than 0.5% body weight, you're really not going to influence the forage consumption at all. Remember Erika's earlier slide, a pound of supplement does not mean a pound decreased intake of pasture for that animal. So less than 0.5% body weight, you're really not going to be making a difference to your forage consumption. But you will be increasing your average daily gain a little bit by increasing that energy in your diet. If you're supplementing at greater than 1% of the body weight, you should start seeing a decrease in that forage consumption. Depending on what type of supplement, your response will be a little bit different, but a grain-based supplement will decrease your forage consumption more than a fiber-based supplement will. So looking at like a corn versus a soy hull. Both of those, however, will give you increased average daily gain just because of that increased energy in their diet. A lot of producers' daily delivery of supplement isn't really feasible and can be challenging, so you don't have to supplement every single day. Supplementing of every other day can be done, but you're not like going to change your forage consumption as much as you would with the daily supplementation. It tends to be more successful with a digestible fiber source versus corn grain or a starch supplement. This accounts for multiple days of intake. When you look at the most common supplement strategies producers use, you're going to be supplementing energy or a grain, you're going to be supplementing a protein or supplementing fat. And today we've really pretty well focused on energy supplementations. And there's a few reasons for that. First and foremost, in Iowa and our cool season pastures, more often than not, our energy is our most limiting nutrient. So using that energy supplement to increase the plane of nutrition is a strategic way to improve your reproductive success. In addition, in Iowa and much of the Midwest, tall fescue tends to be a pretty dominant grass species, and that energy supplementation and having a supplement out there can help mitigate some of the impact that might have during the breeding season. Protein supplements in Iowa and our spring, early summer pastures, we're really not that limited on protein per se. We have that growing grass adequate to meet our protein requirements. But if you're on a lower protein forage or on like range type ground, you can get a good response from protein supplementation. Just traditionally, if we have been supplementing protein on our Iowa pastures, a lot of that has been distillers grains or gluten feed, and with current markets and ethanol production, that's probably not going to be feasible for this breeding season. In addition, protein outside of those byproducts can be more expensive to supplement. So if it's not your limiting nutrient, you don't need to focus on that, and energy will tends to be more beneficial. And so that's why we emphasize that more than protein today. And then fat supplementation can also be used strategically to help reproduction. A lot of the successful fat supplementation strategies, the basis of it is providing energy. There's some interactions based on fatty acid profiles and metabolic signals that happen as well, but the main purpose is to provide energy. Pre-calving, there's some success there with lower amounts of fat. Post-calving, it can be kind of inconsistent in whether you have a positive response or not. And so especially if it's not really economical, we don't necessarily recommend or turn to fat supplementation when we're talking about how do you get increased energy in that diet.
Okay, so our next couple slides that we have is really focused on minerals. And so we spent a lot of time talking about energy and protein requirements of the female going into the breeding season, but also it's a pretty critical time to think about our mineral and vitamin requirements of those females too. So a cow has those requirements during this time frame as well. So basically she's going to recover her own maintenance requirements before she considers utilizing those extra nutrients to go towards that calving or breeding, excuse me, to maintaining that next. So in Iowa, we did kind of a producer survey a few years ago and really kind of asked producers what they were paying for their mineral program. And of course, we saw a wide range and what that looked like, but on average, it was $35 per pair per year. So realistically, that's pretty cheap insurance to helping maintain that pregnancy. So probably the number one question we get in regards to minerals is kind of what source is the best to use. So when we're talking about mineral nutrition, primarily there are two sources that we really look at. So our inorganic versus our organic or chelated minerals. So inorganic are what are naturally found in the earth, and those are less bioavailable to that animal. So there is an increased risk of antagonists. So basically something else coming in and binding to that mineral source so that animal cannot utilize that mineral that's there. So when we look at a mineral tag, we'll probably see lots of terms like sulfates, oxides, chlorides, carbonates that we'll see on that mineral tag. And those are a good indication that we're talking about an inorganic source of a mineral. And for the most part, our inorganics are much cheaper than what our organics or chelated minerals would look like. So the thing that's different about those organic minerals is basically they contain some type of a carrier, so whether that's an amino acid or a carbohydrate, that doesn't allow something else to bind to that mineral within the animal's rumen. So therefore the animal can make better utilization and has increased bioavailability of that mineral source. So we have a decreased risk just because it's more likely to be utilized by the animal. So if you look at the mineral tag, you'll see terms there that are pertaining to some type of an amino acid or whatever that carrier would be for that mineral source. So in general, our inorganic minerals are sufficient to meet cow requirements, but it's pretty uncommon if we ever look at a mineral tag to find a mineral source that is 100% inorganic. So really the driving factor for determining if we need organic or chelated minerals is to know what our diet and our water resources are. If we have antagonists, and minerals can be their own antagonists for others too. So for example, copper, iron and sulfur are our biggest concerns for mineral antagonists. Then that's probably a situation where we're going to need a higher percentage of those organic minerals compared to those organics. So a good thought process here is a lot of times when we make corn stalks, we pick up a lot of dirt. And so those are a good source of iron, which can be a good antagonist for some of those other minerals. So if we're in a situation where we have provided corn stalks as a main roughage source for those cows throughout the winter months, then maybe there would definitely be a need for that increase of organic minerals. Something else we also get a lot of questions about is kind of in regards to what mineral packs, what those are. And so a lot of times when we think of that, it's just kind of how those different brands are marketing. So for example, we might see or hear terms like a breeder's aid mineral or a fescue mineral or a summer mineral. And realistically, what the difference is between these and some of the other mineral sources or packs that we might see is just that ratio of what that blend of inorganic to organic minerals look like. So typically during times of stress, so coming into breeding season, we're going to see an increase in those organic minerals that are included within that pack. So that's just basically saying that those minerals are more utilized for that animal to help meet her requirements of going into the breeding season and maintaining that pregnancy. The big disclaimer here I always encourage producers to think about is to make sure that you're using these minerals as they're intended to be. So these mineral packs are intended to be seasonal. And so really it's important, obviously they have more organic minerals in there, so they're going to be more expensive. So make sure that we're just reading those labels, utilizing them for that time period that's they're recommended for instead of throughout the whole year. we also kind of tend to get questions about how we can administer minerals. So by far the most common is just through oral, which is either offered in a free choice. So we stick it in a mineral feeder and fill it as it's needed, or it can also be included in a supplement that we deliver. So when we're talking about oral minerals, typically this includes our macro and micro minerals, vitamins, and salt are all in one package. So it's easy from that standpoint. And then of course too, there might be some other additives that are included there as well, depending on what that mineral would look like. Another more common mineral is kind of the injectable route. So Multimin 90 is by far the most common one that's on the market. And it only contains of those minerals versus all of those requirements that a cow might have. And a big kind of disclaimer that's, as producers, we tend to forget sometimes is that when we're using an injectable mineral product, it is intended to be utilized in combination with that oral mineral program. So really this is utilized to kind of boost that mineral status near critical times in that production stage, such as right before breeding season. There has been a lot of variable research that has been kind of shown with the injectables and how that might benefit even the cow and the bull when we're utilizing that in pre-breeding. And a lot of that has just been driven by if those animals themselves are marginally deficient or deficient within their mineral status. So if they are a little bit more deficient, they have a better response to that injectable mineral than if they wouldn't. So the problem with that is we can't typically look at our cows and know if they have a mineral deficiency or not. So it is kind of a good insurance to use. But the disclaimer here, and same thing with our oral minerals too, is to make sure that we read those labels and are achieving those rates that are put on there. Especially with injectables, it's pretty easy to run into some selenium toxicity issues if we're not administering those as they're intended. So this last slide here is just looking at ionophores. And so ionophores are a feed additive that help improve feed efficiency. And basically how that works is by slightly decreasing the maintenance requirement of those rumen microbes within the animal. So basically they're more common in the feedlot setting, but they have the same application to a beef cow, even on a forage diet. So Rumensin or Meninsin is the only ionophore that is labeled for mature cows. And so it does not have a free choice. So that means that we can't just stick it in a mineral feeder and walk away. It needs to be delivered on a daily basis. But as Beth and I have kind of mentioned throughout this, that there's probably a lot of benefit to supplementing those females going into the breeding season. So it's a nice alternative to add that in with whatever your supplement is and offer that on a daily basis. So this study is a little bit older, but it's been repeated from more times as well. It just kind of shows the benefit of having that ionophore in that mineral package. So the gray bar there would be our control. So those females were not given an ionophore versus those red bars there would be having that ionophore in the mineral mix. And basically across all these studies, when we're feeding that ionophore, there is about 18 days shorter of our post interval. So those females start cycling a little bit quicker. So on average, ionophores are pretty cheap. And if it's a way to get those females cycling sooner in their breeding season, that's definitely going to be beneficial and pay for themselves.
Okay, so kind of to start wrapping up this webinar for you today, just our biggest tips for success entering your breeding season. Body condition scoring is important. You need to understand what your base nutritional stores of your cows are. Body condition score at calving is really highly correlated with reproductive success. And then body condition scoring before that, during the second, third trimester, can be really beneficial because if they are short and need extra groceries, that is by far a more economical time frame to add weight to your cows than if you wait until just at calving and try to add weight to them when they are lactating and getting into the peak lactation right before breeding season. Regardless of what their body condition score is, females benefit from a positive plane of nutrition prior to breeding. So if you do have some skinnier animals, that's okay. Ideally, they're at that 5 or higher, but if they aren't, make sure you get them on an increasing plan of nutrition and gaining weight going into the breeding season to help them be a little more successful and more likely to conceive. When you supplement, especially for AI groups and stuff, don't just supplement until the day the bulls turned out or the day you AI or that the first couple weeks of the breeding season. Continue supplementing for a few weeks after breeding just to help them maintain their pregnancies and keep the embryo quality high so they won't have as much early embryonic loss or issues from that standpoint. And also remember that for your younger females, they might technically have a lower requirement, but because their intake's depressed, they need a more nutrient-dense diet, and they need a little extra attention in TLC going into the breeding season for that reason. And then also just it takes a lot to develop heifers and get them to be bred the first year. You don't want to let them fall out of the herd on year 2 or 3 breeding, and so reproductive success there is really important for those females. And finally, this table here, it was put together to kind of show how body condition score relates to your bottom line and your yearly income for cows. It was originally published out of Florida in '98, but it's been revised from Purdue since then. And then Erika was kind enough to revise it again today, where the prices in gray reflect what the future prices of feeder cattle are in Iowa come August. So that she looked that up today, and lately the market fluctuation is kind of hard to go off of. So more than anything, paying attention to the actual numbers, pay attention to the gaps and differences between. So if you look on the right or on the left here, different body condition scores, as you increase your body condition score of that cow at calving, there's an expected pregnancy rate for those animals, as well as the calving interval days. For those skinnier animals, you're assuming a longer postpartum interval, and so they're going to breed a little bit later in the breeding season, which then this calf WA is your calf weaning age. So those skinnier animals that got bred later in the season, when you wean, those calves will be younger and not have gained as well while they were on mom as comparative to the ones that were born early in the calving season, resulting in a lower weaning weight for those animals. That's been shown and makes sense. Earlier they're born in the season, the heavier they're going to be. And then once you add a futures price to that calf weaning weight and look at the income per calf, there's quite a spread in the yearly income per cow based on just looking at her body condition score and what those likelihood estimations are for how she's going to breed back. So there's definitely value in using the money you can gain on the yearly income per cow to get those animals supplemented and bred back earlier and make sure they're in the right plan of nutrition going into the breeding season. So with that, we'll gladly take any questions. There will be one other poll question that pops up here as we wrap up, if you don't mind answering.
So the next slide we wanted to show here was just our extension beef program specialist for Iowa State. So if you're not familiar with us, we're a team of 6 out in the field, and then we have Beth on campus and several other staff and faculty that are on campus as well. So if you're in Iowa and have a beef related question, feel free to reach out to us. And then of course there down towards the bottom right, we have the Iowa Beef Center website listed too. So if you have other questions regarding that or looking for more information. And then lastly, we just wanted to kind of take this time to remind you of our other webinars in the series that are going on. So on Thursday at noon, we have Taylor Grusing from Vitelli. She is out of South Dakota, will be joining us and talking about using some reproductive technology to move up the breeding season, primarily focused on the female herself. And then next week on our third session on Tuesday, we have Dr. Tyler Dolman, who's going to be speaking on managing the bulls, more particularly their nutrition, management of them, and kind of talking a little bit about some of the BSEs, breeding soundness exams, and the importance that that has on the breeding season. And then lastly, Patrick Wall with our ISU extension team will be talking about heterosis and some of the genetics benefits that can come from that. So I think that we did have one question earlier that we will address, but please do keep those questions coming in, and we'll try to address those as we can. So our question that has came in so far is, what would you suggest for supplementation of cow-calf pairs as you transition them from a dry lot to mainly a grass/pasture-based diet? And I think hopefully we've already kind of addressed some of this. Right now, based on economics and current availability, I think corn seems to be like the natural fit for producers here in Iowa. And I would encourage you to think about what you're feeding now as well. So those females are probably on some type of a lactation-based diet. So that is going to include some type of a grain supplement anyway. So consider what you're feeding now. Take that to pasture as well. So for example, if you're feeding 5 pounds of corn, as you go to pasture with those females, I would encourage you to consider feeding that corn on a daily basis too, just like you were prior to. So obviously our forage has changed, but that supplement would still be beneficial as well. And then make sure that you continue to supplement those females through the breeding season and kind of make a slow transition off of that supplement.
And I'll add to that, Erika, if you're asking about turning out like right now necessarily or shortly, remember to pay attention to what your forage availability is, and especially keep them semi-consistent and make sure there's adequate forage available, whether you have to supplement with hay or something as well, and transition them to be fully on grass. And like she said, if you're breeding, don't change them off of that corn too fast. That supplement will still be beneficial for them. So I don't see any questions coming in. Thanks for joining, and we hope to see you same time and place Thursday.